So, welcome back to the Cold War, and we're going to talk about the military alliances of the Cold War. We have the economic already lined up, the Soviet bloc, the Western bloc. We also have military alliances formed that would help protect each other from the enemy of each other. So basically, the West and the East form military alliances. So with tensions rising in Europe between East and West, 12 Western nations signed the North Atlantic Pact in April of 1949. This was a mutual defense agreement. If one nation was attacked, the others would come to its aid. The original members of NATO were the United States, Great Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, Canada, Portugal, and Italy. In 1952, the Greeks and the Turks joined. In 1955, West Germany joins the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. With West Germany joining NATO in 1955, the Soviet Union creates its own military alliance called the Warsaw Pact. The members of the Warsaw Pact are Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, and Romania. And something that it still exists today, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, and has actually expanded into former Soviet states. And there is an article within the NATO alliance treaty that says if, like we said earlier, if one nation gets attacked, all nations will come to its aid. This has become sort of a sticking point where we're at right now in the world, because right now the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are members of NATO, and with the Russians flexing their muscles and possibly wanting to take back territory, the question is, Article 5 of the treaty, like it said, states if one is attacked, they come to defend it. Would the United States go to war, or would Western Europe go to war, World War III basically, if this Russians invaded a small Baltic state? That's something that's actually something we need to think about, or that is being thought about even right now today. So the first real hot war that took place during the Cold War was the Korean War. So the containment policy is primarily used in Europe, but the first real battle of the Cold War takes place in Korea. At the end of World War II, Korea was liberated from Japan and divided at the 38th parallel. The United States backed the government of the South, the Soviets backed the government of the North. In June 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, and in accordance with the Truman Doctrine, troops were sent to help the South Koreans, and they also the South Koreans also received support from the newly founded United Nations. At the beginning of the war wasn't going well for the Americans and its UN allies. By mid-September, basically North Korea had conquered all of the Korean peninsula, reuniting it under communist rule. So in September of 1950, General MacArthur became commander of the UN forces and landed his UN forces at Incheon near Seoul. Now, they were basically landed behind enemy lines. This was a very daring invasion, but MacArthur was a daring man. He was able to drive the North Koreans back to the 38th parallel. President Truman ordered MacArthur to invade North Korea, hoping to wipe out the communists altogether. By October of 1950, MacArthur invades the North and quickly defeats the North Koreans, pushing UN forces all the way to the Yalu River, which is the border between Korea and China. Now, China falls to the communists in 1949, so China is now a communist nation, and seeing that the West was encroaching on them, they invade what is now territory controlled by the UN and drives the UN forces back to the 38th parallel. By 1951, the war is a stalemate, but it continues to go on for another 2 years before the armistice is signed in 1953. So another general that was in command was General Ridgway. And he gets, like I said, the UN forces get pushed back to the 38th parallel. Truman looks to sign a peace treaty or negotiate a peace treaty with the Chinese. MacArthur couldn't stand the idea of cutting a deal with the communists, not after so many men had died. He was also very staunch anti-communist. So he ignores Truman's orders and demands that China surrenders or face a United States invasion. MacArthur also criticized the president in the press. You don't do that. Especially since Truman refused to use nuclear weapons in Korea or China. At that time, we were the only country that had nuclear weapons that we knew about. The Soviets had them and were testing them. It was MacArthur's threat of invasion that ended the peace negotiations and basically allowed the war to continue for another 2 years. Truman fires MacArthur for insubordination. So taking a look at the cost of the Korean War, the Korean War basically prompts the United States to implement NCS 68, a National Security Council report that called for a massive military buildup to wage the Cold War. NSC 68 tripled defense spending as well as fueled anti-communism both at home and abroad. So taking a look at some of the numbers here for the cost of the Korean War, you have 36,516 dead. You have a total of almost 500,000 United Nations soldiers dead. You can see the countries that took part in the Korean War there on the left. The armistice was signed on July 27th, 1953. And North Korea and South Korea are still in a state of war. They've just basically had it on pause for the last 60 years. And we also touched base on NSC Note 68, which basically created Cold War spending to contain the Soviet Union and the spread of communism. So the Cold War at home. I'm going to say we have some pictures here of Brave Sentinels, Red Channels, Communist Influence in Radio and TV. I Married a Communist, Joseph McCarthy. So we will talk about that. So basically, at the end of the war, the soldiers thought it was over. Soldiers are coming back home to get their jobs back. Women want to they wanted to keep women out of their jobs. Business leaders were pressuring Truman to remove government regulations enacted during the war, such as price controls and pro-labor. The war was over. Workers refused to give up their rights. They had wanted these rights through with Roosevelt, and they basically didn't want to give them up now that the war was over. Strikes broke out after the war. You have the GI Bill, which allowed a lot of these returning soldiers to go to school and further their education. You also have what is known as the Second Red Scare. The first Red Scare took place right after the end of the First World War, when the Soviet Union was first conceived. The Second Red Scare took place after communist forces under Mao Zedong took control of China. And now, basically, the communists controlled the two largest nations on earth, the Russia and China. You have espionage trials that you have Claude Fuchs and Julius and Ethel Rosenberg basically giving the secrets of the atomic bomb to the Soviet Union. With that gave them the bomb so they could develop nuclear weapons, so we were not the only nuclear power after that. So you have Senator Joseph McCarthy. He really was the man who created sort of what you could say is a witch hunt for communists within the government and society. He heads the House Un-Americans Activities Committee, or HUAC. Now the Republican Party realized that anti-communism played well with the American people, and the Republican Party criticized the Truman administration for being soft on communism. So under Truman's watch, China falls, the Soviets get the bomb, and the Korean War happens. So as a result, the Republicans pass two acts. Truman vetoes the McCarran Act, and Congress overturns that veto. Senator Joseph McCarthy from Wisconsin basically rose from an unknown to the head of the House Un-Americans Activity Committee. He badgered witnesses and accused them of being communists. The thing is, he never had any evidence against these people, and if they questioned him, they would be branded communist. In 1954, he finally went too far when he accused the Army of harboring communists. This debate, or this part of this meeting with the Army on the committee, aired on live TV, and basically revealed McCarthy's malicious behavior to millions of Americans across the country. They didn't know this is what he did. They found out. And basically, shortly after that, the Senate censured McCarthy for his misconducts in the hearings, and basically ended his career. So the man was living off of the fear of communism spreading in the United States, and he took advantage of that. So with that, we're going to go ahead and finish this little segment, and we will get back and finish our basic first look into the Cold War right after this. So I will see you guys on the other side, and here's a little taste of what we will be looking at on the other side.